The prints in the snow created a narrative that silenced even the most talkative frontiersman. Each impression stretched 4 feet in length, individual claw marks carved deeply into the white powder that had fallen during the night. The massive bear had passed within yards of sleeping men as dawn broke, near enough that moisture from its breathing could have fogged the shelter fabric, near enough to slaughter anyone it chose. Yet that observation wasn't what transfixed the gathered trappers. What arrested all conversation was the destination of those massive prints. They marched directly toward the ludicrous deadfall everyone had dismissed as worthless. 21 days prior, these identical men had mocked the entire concept. Winter's grip on the Green River Valley grew brutal as 1829 advanced. Modern maps would identify this location in contemporary Wyoming territory. For men of that era, however, civilized geography held no meaning. This was untamed country, territory where roughly 3,000 fur hunters roamed between 1820 and 1840, pursuing beaver pelts that commanded exceptional prices back in Missouri settlements. Late January found most trapping companies settled into seasonal camps. These temporary communities occupied sheltered valleys offering adequate game populations and protection from the season's harshest weather. Years of frontier experience had established reliable patterns. Trappers labored aggressively during autumn months, September through December, when beaver fur developed maximum thickness. Then arrived January and February's savage conditions, forcing even the toughest individuals to cluster together, awaiting warmer temperatures. Mountain winters, however, never permitted complete idleness. Standard winter encampments sheltered 20 to 50 individuals separated into trappers and maintenance personnel. Those handling camp operations managed cooking duties, pelt processing, cordage fabrication, equipment repair, and horse herd supervision. The fur hunters rotated through these responsibilities while also venturing forth during weather breaks to inspect traplines or secure fresh meat. Green River's camp that season operated under informal leadership of veterans trained by William Ashley and Andrew Henry's Fur Enterprise. By 1829, these represented the trade's second generation. Survivors who'd accumulated sufficient experience to understand both their profession and its inherent dangers. Warren Blackwood belonged to this category, despite his anonymity in published fur trade histories. He'd traveled west during 1825's spring season. Missouri newspaper promotions had recruited ambitious youth willing to labor for roughly $200 annual. At 22, he'd craved escape from settlement civilization's constraints. 4 mountain years had educated him regarding topics no recruitment advertisement acknowledged. Grizzly bears represented North America's apex predator. Winter temperatures killed as efficiently as hostile tribal warriors. Beaver populations showed alarming decline in previously abundant waterways. Survival demanded perpetual adaptation and innovation. The grizzly situation had deteriorated steadily throughout winter months. Convention insisted grizzlies hibernated. Universal frontier wisdom accepted this as fact. Autumn's progression triggered hyperphagia, a feeding frenzy where bears consumed extraordinary quantities, building fat reserves. Individual grizzlies might devour 45 daily pounds during this period, adding 5 pounds of body mass each day. Subsequently, declining temperatures and accumulating snowfall drove bears toward excavated dens on slopes facing north, typically at altitudes exceeding 5,000 feet. Protected beneath snow accumulations measuring several feet thick, grizzlies entered torpor states. This differed from true hibernation observed in smaller mammals, representing instead profound dormancy where cardiac rates plummeted from 40 per minute to merely 8. Core temperatures decreased moderately. Den occupation persisted 4 to 7 months, depending upon weather severity and individual bear conditioning. This represented established behavioral cycles, patterns trappers relied upon for safety. Except not every bear honored these patterns. Male grizzlies, particularly large dominant specimens, frequently delayed den entry and emerged earliest. Additionally, certain bears in winters following abundant autumn feeding or experiencing temperature fluctuations never committed fully to denning. These animals entered what later biologists would term ambulatory hibernation, moving lethargically yet remaining conscious, remaining deadly. Green River's camp had confronted such an animal since January's midpoint. Initial evidence appeared when a camp worker discovered horse prints departing the secured herd area. Following the morning snow trail revealed a sorrel mare's remains 200 yards into surrounding timber. The grizzly had executed her with one devastating strike, snapping vertebrae, then consumed portions of the carcass for hours based on track evidence. Frontier wealth calculations centered on horse ownership. Horses transported commercial goods, hauled trap pelts, and determined whether men possessed mobility or faced stranding in dangerous territory. Individual trapper horses commanded approximately 100 St. Louis dollars, nearly 6 months' compensation for employed company men. The loss inflicted practical and economic damage. Camp hunters departed, tracking the grizzly. The trail proved unmistakable. Grizzly prints were distinctive, enormous, with complete toe impressions visible in snow or yielding earth. Forward paws measured 10 to 12 inches lengthwise, 7 to 8 inches across. Claws contributed additional 3 to 4 inches, appearing as profound punctures beyond pad impressions. They pursued the bear 6 miles before losing sign where it traversed rocky terrain, swept bare by wind. Nobody proposed continuing pursuit. 1820s grizzly bears were recognized as virtually unkillable using available frontier firearms. Standard armament consisted of 50 or 54 caliber flintlock rifles. Possessing adequate accuracy, yet requiring flawless shots, penetrating vital anatomy, to neutralize bears weighing 600 to 900 pounds. Wounded grizzlies represented exponentially greater threats than undisturbed specimens. Bears traversed difficult terrain faster than horses, achieving 30-mile-per-hour velocities during brief charges. 3 days afterward, the bear revisited camp. This occasion, it ignored horses. It simply traversed camp perimeter around midnight based on snow evidence, passing between shelters within effortless striking distance of unconscious men. The implication was unmistakable. The bear had learned that human encampments provided food sources: horses, discarded materials, preserved meat. This created complications lacking simple solutions. Hunting the bear required organizing dedicated pursuit, meaning reassigning men from critical winter duties. It meant accepting substantial risk. Grizzly confrontations possessed legendary reputations for catastrophic outcomes among mountain men. Period documentation recorded numerous fatalities. 1823 alone witnessed both Hugh Glass and Jedediah Smith surviving maulings that should have proven fatal. Other individuals weren't as fortunate. Steel trapping mechanisms proved inadequate. The era's most powerful trap was Newhouse's No. 5 model. Engineered specifically for black bears, it weighed roughly 19 pounds, featuring 11 3/4-inch jaw separation. Grizzly applications utilized the No. 6, weighing 42 pounds with 16-inch jaw capacity. Contemporary trappers nicknamed it the Supreme Bear Controller. Yet even No. 6 traps suffered significant limitations. Primarily, few trappers transported such massive mechanisms into mountain regions. Weight constraints were prohibitive when every pound mattered for provisions and beaver trapping equipment. Additionally, even when captured, grizzlies frequently extracted themselves from traps or shattered restraining chains. Furthermore, deploying such traps demanded expertise that could prove fatal if bears arrived during improper setup. Practical reality meant mountain men avoided grizzly confrontations. They created noise traversing areas where bears might be denned. They maintained camps free of food waste. They hoped bears would remain dormant and ignore trappers. This particular bear refused cooperation. It returned a fourth time 4 days following its midnight patrol. This occasion, it demolished a trapline. Warren Blackwood had maintained beaver sets along a creek remaining unfrozen due to spring-fed flow persisting through deep winter. These installations represented potential income. Any winter-caught beaver provided bonus revenue against lean months. The Grizzly located the trap line and systematically destroyed it. 6 traps extracted from placements, 4 crushed beyond repair, mangled by tremendous force, bait stolen. The message grew even clearer. The bear wasn't merely present, but actively interfering with work-sustaining mountain men's survival. That evening, gathered around fire built inside the largest shelter, Warren Blackwood proposed a concept that made experienced trappers shake their heads with disbelief. A deadfall, he stated plainly, constructed large enough for a grizzly. The silence following wasn't respectful contemplation. It was the silence of men hearing foolishness from someone previously considered intelligent. Deadfall traps had existed for centuries. The concept was elementary. A heavy weight suspended above ground, secured by trigger mechanisms. When animals disturbed triggers while reaching toward bait, the weight dropped, crushing the target. Deadfalls represented ancient technology dating back hundreds or thousands of years. Mountain men employed them regularly for beaver, marten, and smaller animals. But a deadfall for grizzlies in winter. Objections erupted immediately. Logs will be frozen to ground, one man argued. Can't move timber through this snow. Even if you could construct it, no grizzly will stick its head beneath a deadfall, another added. They're not stupid. And if it doesn't kill the bear cleanly, a third man observed, then you've got an injured grizzly that knows exactly who set the trap. These weren't frivolous concerns. They represented accumulated wisdom from men understanding both bears and traps. Blackwood listened without interruption. When objections concluded, he spoke quietly, explaining his reasoning. The bear was active, meaning it hadn't fully committed to denning. Active bears required food. The horse kill proved the bear would investigate anything offering calories. A properly baited deadfall would attract the bear's attention. Regarding construction, it was feasible. Difficult, certainly. Time-consuming, absolutely, but possible. The principles weren't complicated. What was required was scale and careful engineering. The danger of injured bears was genuine. But so was the danger of permitting this bear continuing to learn that camps provided easy food. Eventually, it would kill a man. Sleeping trappers had no defense against grizzlies deciding humans were prey. The persuasion succeeded, though perhaps not through logic alone. Mountain men respected action over words. Blackwood wasn't requesting help. He was explaining what he intended to do. If others wished to assist, they were welcome. If not, he'd attempt it alone. 3 men volunteered. Whether from genuine belief in the plan or simple boredom, during endlessly stretching winter, it didn't matter much. Work commenced the following morning. Location selection was crucial. Blackwood chose a spot 200 yards from camp along the route the Grizzly had used during its midnight visit. The area offered several advantages. Mature timber grew sufficiently thick to provide construction materials. A natural clearing meant they wouldn't need to cut away heavy underbrush. The spot was visible from camp, meaning they could observe from a distance if the trap was triggered. Deadfall construction began with selecting the drop log. This was the weight that would perform the killing, and size mattered enormously. For small animals, a log 8 inches in diameter and 4 feet long provided sufficient crushing force. For a grizzly, the requirements increased dramatically. They needed a log massive enough to kill a 600-pound bear instantly. Not injure it, not trap it. Kill it outright, crushing the chest cavity and vital organs before the bear could react. Traditional methods recommended building traps using multiple logs stacked atop each other to create sufficient weight. But in deep snow with frozen ground and limited mobility, a different approach was needed. Blackwood proposed using a standing dead tree that had fallen during an autumn storm. The tree, a pine that had died years earlier and weathered to gray hardness, measured 14 inches in diameter at its base and stretched 30 feet long. It lay at an angle against other trees, one end elevated 4 feet off the ground, the other buried in snow and frozen earth. Moving it seemed impossible. The crew spent an entire day excavating around the buried end, using trade axes and knives to chip away frozen soil. Mountain men's axes of this era were compact tools weighing 2 to 3 pounds, designed for portability rather than heavy logging work. Progress was measured in inches. By the second day, they had freed the log's base but faced a new problem: leverage. 4 men couldn't lift a 14-inch pine log 30 feet long. Even if they could, moving it through deep snow to the selected trap site presented challenges that brute strength couldn't overcome. The solution came from techniques dating back centuries. They cut 20-foot poles from living timber, creating levers. They built a crude tripod frame near the elevated end of the log. They used rope made from buffalo hide, standard trapper equipment for securing loads on packhorses, to create a pulley system multiplying their lifting power. The work consumed 4 days. 4 days of cold that froze breath into ice crystals. 4 days of snow falling intermittently, requiring constant clearing of the work site. 4 days of physical labor that left muscles trembling and hands raw despite buffalo hide gloves. But on the 4th day's afternoon, they had moved the massive log to the trap site and positioned it exactly where Blackwood wanted it. The structure they built followed principles described in trapping manuals that would be published decades later, but which existed as shared knowledge among men who worked with traps. The design was called a pole deadfall, scaled up to massive proportions. The base consisted of 2 parallel logs 8 inches in diameter, placed 4 feet apart and running 6 feet in length. These were partially buried in snow to keep them stable. Cross pieces spanning the parallel logs created a stable platform. The drop log, the massive pine they had moved with such effort, rested on the top of the base structure at one end. The other end was elevated 4 feet off the ground, held in place by a trigger mechanism. The trigger was the critical component. It had to be sensitive enough to release when disturbed, but stable enough not to drop prematurely. It had to be strong enough to hold tremendous weight, but designed to fail instantly when the right pressure was applied. Blackwood used a trigger design called the prop and spindle. This mechanism consisted of 3 pieces: a vertical prop that held up the raised end of the drop log, a horizontal spindle that the prop rested against, and a bait stick that connected to the spindle. The prop was a stout piece of oak cut to precise length so that when set, the drop log balanced at the edge of stability. The spindle was a smaller piece that rested in notches, cut into two vertical stakes, driven deep into frozen ground on either side of the trap. The bait stick extended forward from under the drop log, attached to the spindle. The physics were elegant. When an animal pulled on the bait stick, it rotated the spindle. Rotation moved the spindle's notch away from the prop. The prop fell. The drop log dropped. The animal underneath died. On paper, it was simple. In practice, setting the trigger required nerve that most men didn't possess. Someone had to hold the drop log up, while someone else positioned the trigger pieces. If anything slipped, the man under the log would be crushed exactly as they intended to crush the grizzly. They practiced the setting procedure using a smaller log. 10 times they set it and released it until every man understood his role and the sequence of movements required. Only then did they attempt setting the actual trap with the 14-inch drop log. Blackwood insisted on being the man under the log during the final set. If something went wrong, he wanted the responsibility on his own shoulders, rather than watching another man die for his idea. The moment stretched longer than it actually was. The massive log hung above him, held by leverage, and the precise balance of the prop against the spindle. His hands positioned the bait stick, attaching it to the spindle with wraps of buffalo hide cordage. His breathing came shallow and deliberate. One wrong movement, one shifted weight, and the log would fall. But the trigger held. Blackwood crawled backward out from under the trap structure. The deadfall was set. Bait was the next consideration. Grizzlies had powerful noses capable of detecting scents from more than a mile away. The bait needed to be aromatic enough to draw the bear's attention, even in winter when its senses were dulled by torpor states. They used the remains of an elk that hunters had brought into camp 2 days earlier. The liver, kidneys, and heart, organs rich with scent, were tied to the bait stick. Additional meat was placed on the ground just beyond the bait stick, positioned so the bear would have to reach under the suspended log to claim it. The theory was that the grizzly would smell the bait from a distance, approach, and attempt to take the meat. To reach the meat beyond the bait stick, the bear would need to put its head and shoulders under the drop log. When it pulled on the bait stick, the trigger would release. The log would fall, striking the bear across the neck and upper back with roughly 1,500 pounds of force, if the trap worked. That was the morning of January 29, 1829. The trap was set by early afternoon. The crew returned to camp, reported success, and waited. Days passed without result. The bait remained untouched. Snow fell twice, covering the trap site with fresh powder. Men made jokes about the impossible trap that wouldn't catch an impossible bear. On the third night, temperatures dropped hard. The kind of cold that made canvas. Shelters cracked with ice and made breathing painful. The kind of cold that sent men deeper into buffalo robes and kept them there until dawn. The grizzly visited the trap that night. They found the evidence at first light when Warren Blackwood walked out to check the site. Fresh tracks approached from uphill where the bear must have been denned or resting. The tracks circled the trap once, then twice. The bear had investigated thoroughly, taking time to assess the situation. Then the tracks led directly to the trap. The bait was gone. The trigger had released. The massive drop log lay flat on the ground, pinning something underneath. Something that wasn't there anymore. The confusion lasted only seconds. More tracks led away from the trap, heading uphill at a pace that suggested urgency but not panic. The bear had survived. The discussion back at camp turned bitter. Blackwood's critics voiced their opinions forcefully, emphasizing that they'd wasted precious time and effort on a mechanism incapable of performing its intended function. Even if the trap had struck the bear, even if 1,500 pounds of pine had connected with the animal, it hadn't been sufficient. But Blackwood was studying the evidence with the focused attention that had kept him alive through 4 mountain winters. The problem wasn't the trap's failure to function. It was the trap's geometry relative to bear behavior. He had positioned the trigger and bait based on assumptions about how a grizzly would approach. He had assumed the bear would reach forward with its head to grab the meat, putting its neck and shoulders under the log. The tracks told a different story. The bear had approached from the side rather than head-on. It had reached in with one massive paw, hooking the bait with claws, and pulled the meat sideways. When the log fell, it had struck the bear, but not in a vital area. Probably the shoulder or haunch, heavy enough to hurt, perhaps even injure, but not heavy enough to kill or disable. The realization brought both frustration and insight. The trap functioned properly. The mechanism was sound. What needed adjustment was the approach angle and the bait placement. Blackwood proposed rebuilding, this time with modifications based on understanding how a grizzly actually interacted with the trap rather than how humans assumed it would behave. The crew was skeptical. They had spent days building one trap that failed. Building another seemed like repeating a mistake while expecting different results. But Blackwood made his case persuasively. The bear had been hit. It wasn't injured enough to stop being a threat, but it had learned something important. Pulling on bait could cause pain. That knowledge might make it more cautious, or it might make it more determined. Either way, they now knew the trap could strike a moving grizzly. They just needed to strike it in the right place. 2 men agreed to help rebuild. The others returned to camp duties, shaking their heads at what they saw as stubbornness masquerading as persistence. The second trap took less time to construct. They reused the drop log, which was still serviceable. They repositioned it 30 yards from the original site, in a location where the terrain channeled approach angles more narrowly. They built side barriers using logs and brush, creating a funnel that made side approaches difficult. The bear would have to come at the trap from a limited direction if it wanted the bait. The bait placement changed significantly. Instead of putting meat just beyond the bait stick where a bear could hook it with paws, they suspended it from a branch that hung over the trap, positioning it so the bear would need to stand upright or reach straight forward to grab it. This forced a frontal approach where the bear's head and chest would be under the log when the trigger released. They added weight, not to the drop log itself, which was already as heavy as they could manage, but above it. 3 additional logs, each 6 inches in diameter, were positioned to rest on top of the drop log. When the trap triggered and the main log fell, these additional logs would tumble down, adding mass and creating a crushing effect rather than a single blow. The principle was sound. Multiple impacts from different angles would be harder to survive than one heavy strike. The second set was completed on February 4th, 6 days after the first attempt. They baited it with fresh meat from a mule deer, plus the rendered fat and organs. The scent would carry in cold air, drawing any bear within range. And they waited again. This time, the wait was shorter. 3 days. 3 days of wondering whether the bear would return, whether it would be smart enough to avoid the trap after being struck once, whether the modifications would make any difference. On the morning of February the 8th, Warren Blackwood walked out through snow that had fallen overnight. Fresh snow was both good and bad. It covered old sign but made new tracks obvious. The tracks told the story before he reached the trap site. A grizzly had approached from the direction of the timber uphill. This time the approach was direct, suggesting the bear either hadn't connected this trap with the previous one or didn't care. The tracks led straight to the trap site. Then they stopped. The drop log lay flat on the ground. The additional logs had tumbled as designed, creating a pile of timber. And underneath that pile, visible as a patch of brown fur, was the grizzly. The bear was dead. Blackwood stood there in morning cold, breathing clouds of vapor, looking at evidence that the impossible wasn't impossible after all. A massive grizzly, probably weighing close to 700 pounds, had been killed by a trap that men said couldn't work, in conditions that made construction nearly impossible, using techniques that skeptics dismissed as foolish. The crew came out from camp to see the result. The process of removing the logs and examining the bear took most of the morning. The work was laborious. Each log had to be rolled away carefully to avoid further damaging the carcass. The damage was severe and exactly as intended. The drop log had struck the bear across the neck and upper back. The impact had been devastating. The force had broken the spine and crushed the rib cage. The additional logs tumbling down had added enough weight to ensure death was instant. No suffering. No wounded bear escaping to become even more dangerous. The grizzly was an adult male, as they had suspected from the track size. Its paws measured 11 inches long, with claws extending another 3.5 inches beyond the pads. Its weight, estimated by men with experience judging such things, was probably 650 to 700 pounds. It had been a formidable animal, powerful enough to kill horses with single blows, dangerous enough to threaten an entire camp of experienced mountain men. But it had died in a trap built from timber and rope and knowledge that predated firearms by centuries. The story of Warren Blackwood's grizzly trap spread through the Green River camp and beyond with remarkable speed. When trappers from other brigades visited for trade or news, they heard the tale. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Mountain men were famous for storytelling that improved with each retelling. Others showed genuine interest in the technique. What made the trap noteworthy wasn't the physical construction. Men had been building deadfalls for bears for generations across the continent. What made it remarkable was the context. Deep winter, frozen ground, massive timber that shouldn't have been movable, and a grizzly bear that wasn't supposed to be active. But mountain men learned early that supposed to be didn't always match reality. Grizzlies didn't always follow hibernation schedules. Winter weather didn't make work impossible, just more difficult. And impossible was often just another word for no one has figured out how yet. The principles behind the trap were sound and ancient. The pole deadfall design dated back hundreds of years, used by indigenous peoples across North America long before Europeans arrived. The prop and spindle trigger mechanism was known to trappers throughout the continent. What Blackwood contributed was scale, engineering precision, and the willingness to attempt something that others considered impractical. The immediate benefit was obvious. The camp was safer. The grizzly that had killed a horse and destroyed trap lines was dead. Men could sleep without wondering if a massive predator would decide to investigate their shelters during the night. But the larger benefit was knowledge. Other trappers understood that grizzlies could be trapped with deadfalls if the trap was built correctly. It became another tool in the kit of techniques that helped men survive in country that didn't forgive mistakes. The grizzly hide was processed and eventually sold at the summer rendezvous later that year. Grizzly pelts weren't as valuable as beaver. The fur trade was built on beaver, but they brought decent prices from buyers who wanted durable leather or impressive trophies. The hide sold for $20, which was split among the men who had helped with construction. More valuable than the money was the reputation. Warren Blackwood became known as a man who could solve problems through engineering and persistence. That reputation led to work with various fur companies over the next decade, guiding brigades and training new trappers in techniques that went beyond the standard methods everyone knew. The 1829 winter camp at Green River eventually broke up in March as the spring thaw made streams flow again, and beaver became accessible. The men scattered to their traplines, pursuing the pelts that would hopefully make the year profitable. Some would return to St. Louis with fortunes. More would return with enough to survive another year. A few wouldn't return at all. Mountain man life had a way of killing the unlucky or careless. Warren Blackwood continued trapping until 1837, when the collapse of the beaver hat market and the decline of game populations made the business unprofitable. Like many mountain men, he transitioned to guiding wagon trains westward, using knowledge of mountain passes and water sources that he had gained during his trapping years. He died in 1849 in California during the gold rush, having made and lost several fortunes in the constantly shifting frontier economy. But the trap techniques he demonstrated that winter of 1829 became part of the shared knowledge passed between mountain men. Deadfalls for grizzlies remained dangerous and difficult to construct, but they were no longer impossible. They were simply another example of what could be accomplished when men understood principles of leverage, trigger mechanics, and animal behavior. The mountain man era lasted roughly from 1807 through the early 1840s. During those decades, approximately 3,000 men ranged through the Rocky Mountains, competing for beaver pelts in streams that seemed inexhaustible until they suddenly weren't. They faced dangers from the environment, hostile encounters with certain tribal groups, and from the animals they hunted. Grizzly bears represented one of the most persistent threats, appearing in journals and memoirs with frequency that suggested near-universal experience with these dangerous creatures. The firearms available to these men were single-shot flintlocks, accurate but limited. A missed shot meant fumbling with powder, patch, and ball, while a grizzly charged at speeds up to 30 miles per hour. Many trappers survived grizzly encounters only through luck or the intervention of companions. Hugh Glass famously survived a mauling in 1823 and crawled 200 miles to safety despite horrific injuries. Jedediah Smith was attacked by a grizzly the same year, surviving despite having his scalp partially torn from his skull. These stories weren't exceptional. They were common enough that every mountain man expected to encounter grizzlies and worried about whether he would survive the experience. Anything that reduced the danger was worth pursuing, whether that meant better firearms, careful camping practices, or trap techniques that could kill bears without direct confrontation. Deadfall traps offered one solution. They weren't perfect. Construction was labor-intensive. Success rates were variable, and trapped bears could suffer if the trap didn't kill cleanly. But they worked when built correctly, and they allowed trappers to deal with problem bears without the risk of face-to-face confrontation. The trigger mechanism was particularly elegant in its simplicity. The prop and spindle design required precise measurement and careful setting, but once properly balanced, it released instantly when the correct pressure was applied. Modern engineering would calculate the forces involved and create diagrams showing stress points and failure modes. Mountain men simply built them, tested them, adjusted them, and used knowledge gained through experience rather than formal study. The bait selection demonstrated understanding of grizzly behavior that came from years of observation. Bears were drawn to strong scents, particularly the smell of fresh meat and organs. The olfactory capability of grizzlies was remarkable. They could detect food from over a mile away. Using elk or deer organs meant the trap could draw bears from significant distances, increasing the chances of success. The location choice mattered as well. placing the trap along a known travel route meant bears would encounter it during their normal movements rather than requiring them to search for it. Mountain men understood that animals followed patterns, game trails, water sources, ridge lines. Traps placed along these routes had better success than random placement. These principles applied regardless of trap type. Whether using steel traps for beaver, snares for smaller animals, or deadfalls for bears, the underlying knowledge was the same. Understand the animal's behavior. Place the trap where the animal will naturally encounter it. Use bait or lure that appeals to the animal's senses. Build the trap to be effective for the target animal's size and strength. What made Warren Blackwood's trap noteworthy wasn't new techniques. It was the application of known principles at a scale that others considered impractical. The willingness to attempt difficult construction in challenging conditions, the persistence to rebuild after initial failure, the careful observation that identified why the first attempt failed and how to correct it. Those qualities defined successful mountain men, regardless of their specific skills. The mountains didn't reward blind courage or brute strength alone. They rewarded men who could think through problems, adapt to changing conditions, and persist through setbacks. Warren Blackwood's Grizzly trap embodied those qualities in a structure built from pine logs and buffalo hide rope. The broader context of the fur trade era provides important perspective. The beaver-based economy that drew men into the Rocky Mountains was a historical moment that lasted only 3 decades at its peak. By the 1840s, beaver populations had declined from over-trapping. Fashion trends in Europe shifted from beaver hats to silk hats, manufactured in factories. The market that supported mountain men disappeared rapidly. But during those 3 decades, these men opened trails that later generations would follow. They mapped territories that were unknown to the United States government. They established relationships with various tribal groups that sometimes facilitated later settlement and sometimes created conflicts that lasted for generations. They demonstrated that Americans could survive and work in some of the harshest environments on the continent. Their techniques for surviving winter, processing animal hides, navigating mountain terrain, and dealing with dangers like grizzly bears became part of the knowledge base that subsequent frontiersmen would build upon. The methods weren't always pretty or gentle. The mountain man era included plenty of environmental damage, failed relationships with indigenous peoples, and human cost measured in lives lost to weather, animals, and violence. But it also included innovation. Men like Warren Blackwood figuring out how to build a trap that others said couldn't work. Demonstrating that impossible usually just meant difficult or unprecedented, not actually beyond human capability. The tracks in the snow that February morning in 1829 told a simple story on the surface. A grizzly had approached a trap. The trap had functioned as designed. The bear had died. But the broader story of engineering applied under difficult conditions, of persistence overcoming skepticism, of knowledge shared among men who depended on each other for survival. That story resonated beyond one winter camp on the Green River. Mountain men who heard the tale understood what it represented. Not just a successful trap, but proof that careful thought and determined effort could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. That the accumulated knowledge of centuries could be adapted to new challenges. That men working together could accomplish what individuals could not. Those lessons applied as much to beaver trapping as to bear trapping, as much to finding mountain passes as to surviving winter, as much to building the foundation of westward expansion as to any single accomplishment. The trap itself was eventually dismantled for firewood. The logs that had killed a grizzly became fuel for cooking fires, just as the bear's hide became currency at the summer rendezvous. Nothing was wasted in mountain camps where supplies were precious and every resource had to serve multiple purposes. But the knowledge of how to build such a trap persisted. It spread through the informal networks that connected trapping brigades across the Rockies. It became one more technique in the repertoire of skills that distinguished experienced trappers from greenhorns who wouldn't survive their first season. And somewhere in the handwritten journals that a few literate mountain men kept, buried in descriptions of weather and beaver counts and trading prices, might be a brief notation. February 8th, 1829. Grizzly trapped. Deadfall method, successful. Brief, understated. The style of men who measured accomplishments by practical results rather than dramatic storytelling. But behind that notation lay the story of what men could accomplish when they combined knowledge from the past with innovation for the present. When they looked at obstacles labeled impossible and asked what if. The grizzly bear that died in a pole deadfall trap during the winter of 1829 was one animal among thousands that fell to mountain men during the fur trade era. But the trap that killed it represented something larger than a single successful hunt. It represented human ingenuity applied to survival challenges, the willingness to learn from failure, the ability to adapt known techniques to new circumstances. These were the qualities that allowed humans to inhabit every environment on Earth, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest to rocky mountain wilderness, not because humans were stronger or faster or more dangerous than other predators, but because they could think, plan, build, and teach each other what worked. A grizzly trap built in February snow. Using logs moved through seemingly impossible conditions, triggered by a mechanism designed centuries before steel traps existed, killing a bear that shouldn't have been active during deep winter. That was the impossible, made routine through persistence and knowledge. And in making the impossible routine, mountain men opened the West to everyone who followed. The lessons from Warren Blackwood's trap extended far beyond trapping techniques. They spoke to fundamental human capabilities, the ability to observe and learn, to test and refine, to persist through failure until success arrived, the ability to look at a problem everyone called impossible and simply start working on solutions. The grizzly tracks leading to the trap that morning told a story of ending, one dangerous bear's death, removing an immediate threat. But they also told a story of beginning, the beginning of understanding that with proper engineering, even the most dangerous predators could be confronted successfully. That winter didn't forgive mistakes, but it rewarded careful planning. That innovation came from applying old knowledge in new ways rather than inventing everything from scratch. These were lessons that mountain men carried forward, that settlers learned when they followed trails blazed by trappers, that pioneers applied when they built communities in harsh environments. The impossible grizzly trap that shouldn't have worked became proof that shouldn't and can't were often just words people used before someone figured out how. Warren Blackwood figured out how, and that made all the difference.